The unexpected war. The battlefield stretched endlessly under the twin moons, their cold light casting eerie shadows over the fallen warriors. Broken weapons, shattered armor, and the lifeless forms of alien soldiers lay scattered across the crimson-stained ground. The war had raged for decades, and neither side had found victory. At the heart of the battlefield stood the Blade of Aegris, a sword unlike any other. Embedded deep in an ancient stone altar, it had remained untouched for over 1,000 years. Legend claimed that only the rightful champion, chosen by fate, could wield its power. But no alien warrior had ever succeeded. The Rygari Empire, a race of towering, reptilian warlords, believed the sword belonged to them. For centuries, their greatest warriors had attempted to claim it, yet the blade refused them. Even the mighty Shanvak, the Empire's most feared general, had failed. The blade remained silent, its magic rejecting all who touched it. Opposing them were the Valkir Dominion, a race of advanced, blue-skinned beings with minds as sharp as their weapons. They too had tried and failed. Despite their superior technology and psychic abilities, the sword would not bend to their will. Now, with both factions desperate for an advantage, war had erupted once again. As the latest battle came to an end, silence fell over the ruined land. The Rygari and Valkir forces retreated, leaving behind the corpses of the fallen. The air smelled of burning metal and death. The blade remained untouched, waiting. That was when he arrived. A lone figure moved cautiously through the battlefield, stepping over the bodies. He was not a Rygari. Not a Valkir. He was something else. A human. His name was Daniel Cross, and he had no business being here. Daniel was a scavenger, a survivor from Earth. He had come to this world by accident, his ship crashing weeks ago. He had no weapons, no allies, just a desperate need to find shelter and survive. But as he walked, something called to him. A whisper in the wind. A strange pulling sensation deep in his chest. His eyes landed on the Blade of Aegris. It shimmered under the moons, its ancient metal humming with power. It was unlike any weapon he had ever seen. The way it glowed, the way the air around it seemed to ripple, he knew it was special. He had no idea that both alien factions had spent centuries fighting over it. He had no idea that touching it could change everything. All he knew was that something inside him was urging him forward. And so, with cautious steps, he approached the blade. From the shadows, unseen eyes watched him. The Rygari. The Valkir. And something else. The moment his fingers brushed the hilt, the ground trembled. A shockwave of energy surged through the battlefield. And for the first time in history, the Blade of Aegris responded. Daniel's eyes widened. His grip tightened. And the sword moved. The blade's choice. Daniel's fingers barely grazed the hilt when the world changed. A shockwave of energy exploded from the sword, surging through the battlefield like a storm. The ground trembled beneath his feet. The sky, once calm, twisted with crackling lightning. The twin moons darkened. Daniel staggered back, his heart hammering. A deep hum resonated through his bones, a sound not heard for centuries. The Blade of Aegris, long dormant, was awakening. In the shadows, alien warriors watched in horror. The Rygari warlords, hidden behind the jagged remains of a broken war machine, let out guttural growls. Their massive, reptilian bodies tensed. Their most elite champions had failed to lift that sword. And yet, this human, this weak, fragile creature, had moved it. The Valkir observers, watching from the cliffs above, stood frozen. Their luminous blue eyes glowed with psychic energy as they whispered among themselves. It was impossible. The blade was forged by the ancients, bound to the fate of their world. It should have been theirs to wield. But it was answering to him. Daniel felt something crawl up his spine. The weight of unseen eyes. The expectation. The fear. The rage. Then, the voice came. Not from the aliens. Not from his surroundings. It was inside his mind. You are not worthy. Daniel gasped, gripping his head as pain lanced through his skull. The voice was old, heavy with authority. It wasn't a language he knew, but he understood it all the same. The Blade of Aegris was judging him. Testing him. The sword, it was alive. The Rygari warlord broke the silence first. Stop him. A deafening roar shattered the night. The alien warriors charged, their massive feet shaking the battlefield. In a blur of motion, they drew their plasma axes, their jagged blades glowing red-hot. The Valkir reacted next. A single thought passed through their collective minds. They could not let the blade fall into human hands. From the cliffs, a rain of energy bolts rained down. The air crackled as violet streaks of plasma shot toward Daniel, enough to turn him into ash. Time slowed. Daniel had no shield. No armor. No weapon. Only the Blade of Aegris. Somehow, he knew what to do. His body moved on instinct, as if something deep inside him had already trained for this moment. His fingers tightened around the hilt, and this time, the sword lifted. A deafening boom shattered the air as the Blade of Aegris came alive in his grip. A blinding white light erupted from the metal, a wave of energy ripping outward. The charging Rygari were thrown back, their massive bodies crashing into the wreckage behind them. The plasma bolts never reached him, the energy around the sword disintegrated them mid-air. For the first time in history, the blade had chosen a wielder. Daniel felt the power surge through him, flooding his veins like liquid fire. His heartbeat synced with the pulse of the sword. His vision sharpened. His muscles burned with new strength. And then he understood. This was not just a weapon. It was a key. A secret long buried beneath war, blood, and time. And now, every alien on this planet wanted it back. The moment of silence shattered as both factions, Rygari and Valkir, turned their weapons toward him. Daniel stood alone, the legendary blade glowing in his grip. His mind screamed at him to run. But something else, something older, whispered to him instead. Fight. The power of a human. The battlefield had never known silence like this. Daniel stood in the center, the Blade of Aegris glowing in his grip. The air hummed with power, and arcs of white energy crackled along the ancient steel. The moment he had lifted it, everything changed. The Rygari warriors, their towering reptilian bodies covered in thick battle armor, no longer charged blindly. Instead, they stood still, their predator instincts now mixed with fear. The Valkir soldiers, with their advanced weapons and psychic abilities, hesitated as well. Their eyes, glowing with energy, were wide with disbelief. For centuries, this war had raged. For centuries, the blade had denied them all. Yet now, in the hands of a human, it was alive. Daniel's grip on the sword tightened. His breathing was unsteady, his heart pounding like a war drum. He had no idea what just happened. But every instinct told him one thing: he was in trouble. Then, Shanvok stepped forward. The Rygari warlord of blood, the most feared warrior in their empire, was not afraid. His red-scaled body, layered with scars and battle tattoos, radiated power. He towered over Daniel like a living mountain, his golden eyes burning with fury. Human. His deep voice rumbled like a distant storm. You do not understand what you hold. Daniel didn't respond. His grip on the sword was iron-tight. Drop it, Shanvok demanded. Now. Daniel's muscles tensed. Every part of him screamed that this was a bad idea. But something inside, something older than him, refused. No. The air shifted. Shanvok's eyes narrowed. The other Rygari warriors tensed, claws flexing. The Valkir commander, Bilana, floated down from the cliffs, her silver cloak billowing as she landed gracefully. Her psychic presence rippled across the battlefield. "Interesting," she murmured, her blue glowing gaze studying Daniel. "The sword accepts you. But that does not mean you are worthy." Daniel barely had time to process those words before Shanvak attacked. The warlord moved like lightning, his massive bulk betraying his unnatural speed. His plasma axe roared to life, swinging in a brutal arc meant to cleave Daniel in two. Instinct took over. Daniel raised the Blade of Aegris, and the moment the steel met the plasma axe, the world exploded. A shockwave burst outward, sending Shanvak skidding back. The ground cracked beneath Daniel's feet as the force surged through him. And then, it happened. The blade moved on its own. Daniel felt his body shift, his muscles acting without him. A blur of motion, a perfect counterstrike. The sword cut through the air faster than anything he'd ever seen. Shanvak barely dodged. A deep gash split across his armor, glowing with white-hot energy. For the first time, the warlord looked shocked. Daniel stared at the blade in his hand. His heart pounded. That wasn't him. The sword had guided him. A distant voice echoed in his mind. "You are not ready, but you are chosen." Then the ground shook. The ancient ruins around them crumbled, as if some unseen force was responding to the sword's awakening. Massive stone pillars collapsed, revealing something buried beneath. A hidden temple. A place forgotten by time. And from its depths, something stirred. The aliens backed away. Even Shanvak and Velana looked uneasy. Daniel swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the blade. He didn't know what was happening. He didn't know why he was chosen. But one thing was clear, something even more dangerous was waking up. And now, they were all in trouble. The awakening of the forgotten. The ground beneath Daniel's feet rumbled. Deep, ancient tremors spread outward from the collapsed ruins, sending cracks splintering across the battlefield. The very air felt heavier, charged with an unseen force. The Blade of Aegris pulsed in his grip. The energy coursing through it was no longer wild, it was directing him. Guiding him. Daniel barely had time to process what was happening when the Valkir commander, Velana, shouted something in her alien tongue. Her soldiers vanished in a blur of blue light, teleporting away, escaping before whatever lay beneath the ruins emerged. The Rygari warlord, Shanvak, did not run. Instead, he growled low in his throat. His golden eyes flickered between Daniel and the yawning abyss beneath the ruins. "You have doomed us all, human," Shanvak spat. Daniel's breath came fast and uneven. "What's coming?" Shanvak didn't answer. Instead, he took one step back. And for the first time in history, the greatest warrior of the Rygari Empire retreated. Daniel didn't have the luxury of running. Because the darkness below was moving. A deep, unnatural howl rose from the pit. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't alien. It was something older. Something hungry. The ruins cracked further, revealing massive stone doors covered in glyphs that pulsed with an eerie blue light. The air rippled as unseen energy uncoiled from within. Then, the doors shattered. A storm of shadows erupted from the temple, swirling into the sky like a rising maelstrom. The battlefield was swallowed by darkness as an unseen force howled through the ruins. Daniel stumbled backward, gripping the Blade of Aegris as an entity stepped forward from the abyss. It was not an alien. It was not a machine. It was something far worse. A towering figure forged from obsidian metal and living energy, its form shifting between physical and ethereal, like a nightmare barely clinging to reality. Its eyes burned silver, and its presence alone made the air shiver. Daniel felt his lungs tighten. Every instinct in his body screamed that he was standing before something that should not exist. A guardian. A being created not to protect the sword, but to kill any unworthy who tried to wield it. Daniel barely had time to react before it moved. Faster than any living thing should. Faster than any machine. The Guardian struck. Daniel raised the Blade of Aegris just in time. The impact was cataclysmic. A shockwave of energy tore through the battlefield, sending debris flying in all directions. The force ripped through Daniel's arms, nearly tearing the sword from his grip. He gritted his teeth, pushing back with every ounce of strength he had, but it wasn't enough. The Guardian pressed harder, its massive blade of obsidian grinding against the Blade of Aegris, sending sparks of raw energy crackling through the air. Daniel's knees buckled. His vision blurred. The sword was fighting with him, amplifying his strength, but the Guardian was beyond anything he had ever faced. A voice echoed through the air. "You are not worthy." The words hit Daniel like a hammer. The weight of the Guardian's presence pressed down on him, suffocating, drowning. He wasn't a warrior. He wasn't chosen by destiny. He was just a scavenger who got lucky. And now, that luck was running out. Then, the Blade of Aegris flared. A new voice, softer but stronger, whispered in his mind. "Prove them wrong." Daniel's grip tightened. And in that moment, he chose to fight. Summoning every ounce of will, he shifted his stance, not resisting the Guardian's strike, but redirecting it. The obsidian blade slid past him, and in that split second, Daniel moved. The Blade of Aegris sang through the air. And for the first time in eons, the Guardian bled. A howl of rage split the air as the entity staggered back, clutching the glowing wound on its ethereal form. Daniel didn't wait. He pressed forward. If the Guardian wanted to test him, he would prove that humanity was worthy. A warrior is forged. The battlefield trembled. The clash of the Blade of Aegris against the Guardian's obsidian weapon sent shockwaves rippling across the ruins. Sparks of white-hot energy illuminated the darkness as Daniel fought for his life. The Guardian was relentless. It moved faster than anything he had ever seen, striking with precision, its form shifting between solid metal and pure energy. Daniel barely kept up. His arms ached. His breath came in ragged gasps. His mind screamed that he was outmatched. But the Blade of Aegris guided him. For every brutal swing of the Guardian's massive weapon, the sword in his hands countered, redirecting, parrying, fighting alongside him. It wasn't just steel, it was alive, whispering instincts into his mind, showing him how to survive. Still, he was losing. A single mistake was all it took. The Guardian vanished in a flicker of darkness, only to reappear behind him. Daniel barely turned in time as a black blade carved through his side. Pain exploded through his body. He staggered, his vision blurring, his blood dripping onto the stone. The Guardian did not stop. It struck again, a brutal, inescapable arc. Daniel couldn't dodge. His mind screamed. His body refused to move. But the Blade of Aegris did. It pulled him forward, just enough. The Guardian's weapon sliced through empty air, missing him by an inch. For the first time, Daniel understood. The sword wasn't just helping him fight. It was training him. Not just as a wielder. But as a warrior. A choice stood before him. He could keep running. Keep fighting only to survive. Or he could fight to win. He clenched his jaw, ignoring the pain, and tightened his grip on the hilt. "All right," he muttered through gritted teeth. "Teach me." The moment he accepted, everything changed. The sword flared to life, golden runes igniting along its surface. Energy surged through his body, mending his wounds, sharpening his reflexes. And suddenly, he was faster. The Guardian came at him again, a whirlwind of death. But this time, Daniel didn't just react. He moved first. His blade cut through the darkness, turning defense into attack. The Guardian staggered. Daniel pressed forward. A strike, precise, fluid, unstoppable. His sword met the Guardian's core. A deafening shockwave erupted, splitting the sky. The Guardian let out a piercing, inhuman shriek, and collapsed, its form unraveling into the very shadows it was born from. The silence that followed was absolute. The blade of Aegris pulsed in his grip, as if satisfied. Daniel exhaled shakily, staring at the fading remnants of his enemy. He had won. No, he had become something more. A warrior. A wielder of the blade. And as he turned to face the Rygari warlord and the Valkir commander, still watching from the ruins, he knew one thing for certain. This war wasn't over. It was just beginning. The price of power. The battlefield was silent. The Guardian was gone, its form dissolved into shadows, leaving behind nothing but the echoes of its haunting scream. The blade of Aegris hummed in Daniel's grip, pulsing like a heartbeat, as if it too could feel the weight of what had just happened. Daniel's breathing was ragged. His body ached, his wounds still raw despite the sword's strange energy keeping him upright. He wasn't sure if it was healing him or simply keeping him alive long enough to fight again. And then, he felt it. A presence. No, two of them. Daniel slowly turned. The Rygari warlord, Shanvak, stood motionless, his massive red-scaled body radiating tension. His golden eyes locked onto Daniel, not with fury, but with something worse. Recognition. The Valkir commander, Belana, floated just beyond the ruins, her blue glowing gaze piercing through the shadows. The swirling energy around her rippled unnaturally. Daniel wasn't the only one who had changed. The moment he defeated the Guardian, something in the balance of this world shifted. The blade had chosen. And that meant one thing. The war was no longer between the Rygari and the Valkir. It was now between them and him. The human must die. Shanvak's clawed hand tightened around his war axe. The blade is ours, human. His voice was low, dangerous, carrying the weight of generations. You are an accident. That sword was meant for Rygari champions, not some lost scavenger. Daniel's grip on the sword tightened, his exhaustion replaced by something colder. Then why couldn't any of you lift it? Shanvak's nostrils flared, but it was Velana who spoke next. Because the blade is flawed, she said, stepping forward. Daniel frowned. Flawed? She tilted her head, studying him with those unnerving, glowing eyes. The sword was never meant to be lifted by a creature as unpredictable as a human, she murmured. We have spent centuries deciphering its secrets, learning from it. And now, you have ruined everything. Daniel let out a bitter laugh. I ruined everything. I just survived something none of you could beat. You should be thanking me. Shanvak's voice rumbled. It is not about survival. It is about control. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The blade of Aegris wasn't just a weapon, it was a source of power. A key to something greater. And now, both factions wanted it back. Shanvak took a step forward. Velana hovered closer. For the first time, the Rygari and Valkir stood united. Against him. Daniel's jaw clenched. This wasn't a fight for a sword anymore. It was a fight for his right to exist. The attack. There was no warning. Shanvak moved first, faster than a creature his size should be able to. His war axe blurred through the air, aiming to split Daniel in half. At the same time, Velana raised her hands, and the very gravity around Daniel shifted, his limbs felt like they were being crushed, pinned by an unseen force. Daniel's instincts screamed. The blade of Aegris reacted instantly. A burst of white energy exploded from the sword, knocking Shanvak back mid-strike. The gravity snapped apart, sending Velana staggering as Daniel broke free. He didn't think. He moved. His blade clashed against Shanvak's axe, the impact sending another shockwave through the battlefield. Sparks flew as the metal shrieked under the force. Velana vanished, her body flickering like a mirage, then reappeared behind him. Daniel ducked just in time, her psychic energy slicing through the air where his head had been. It was 2 against 1. And both of them were faster. Stronger. More experienced. But Daniel had something they didn't. He had the blade. And the sword wanted him to win. The revelation. The battle was brutal, a blur of strikes, counterstrikes, and raw survival. Daniel had never fought like this before. His body moved beyond his limits, his reflexes sharp enough to dodge strikes that should have killed him. But it wasn't enough. Shanvok's strength was overwhelming. Velana's precision was terrifying. Little by little, they pushed him back. Daniel's muscles screamed. His wounds burned. The blade's energy was keeping him on his feet, but even that had limits. He was running out of time. Then, he saw it. A vision. Not of the present. But of the past. The sword showed him. The first wielder of the Blade of Aegris. A human. Not a Rygari. Not a Valkir. A human. The truth slammed into Daniel like a tidal wave. The Rygari had fought for centuries, believing the blade was theirs by right. The Valkir had studied it, believing it was a weapon of knowledge and control. But neither of them had ever been worthy. Because the Blade of Aegris had never belonged to them. It had always belonged to his kind. And that's why it had chosen him. The rage in his chest turned into fire. He was done running. Done questioning. It was time to end this fight. The turning point. Shanvok and Velana lunged at him one last time, their strikes meant to kill. But Daniel was ready. The Blade of Aegris pulsed, its energy ripping through his veins. He didn't just react, he anticipated. He stepped forward. His blade cut through the air. And the battlefield erupted in light. The last stand. The battlefield was blinding with light. The Blade of Aegris burned in Daniel's hands, a storm of energy swirling around its edge. The moment of hesitation was gone. The sword had shown him the truth, he was always meant to wield it. This war wasn't about the Rygari or the Valkir. It was about who was worthy to shape the future. And he was done running. The final strike began. The clash of titans. Shanvok, the Rygari warlord, charged like a living avalanche, his massive war axe crackling with plasma. His golden eyes were filled with fury, with betrayal, he had spent his life believing the sword belonged to his people. Velana, the Valkir commander, vanished into shimmering energy, reappearing behind Daniel in a blur of psychic force. Her hands pulsed with violet flames, ready to tear him apart at the molecular level. 2 warriors. 2 empires. 1 human in their way. And for the first time, Daniel wasn't afraid. His body moved before thought, the Blade of Aegris guiding him like a phantom limb. He didn't block Shanvok's strike, he sidestepped it. The warlord's axe crashed into the ground, splitting the battlefield in 2. Velana struck next. She lashed out with pure energy, enough force to disintegrate steel. But Daniel turned the blade, and for the first time, the sword absorbed the energy. Then, it returned it. A shockwave of light blasted outward, sending Velana hurtling back through the air. Shanvok roared, swinging his axe in a wild, desperate arc. But Daniel was faster. He stepped inside the swing. And then, he struck. The Blade of Aegris pierced through Shanvok's armor, cutting deep. For the first time, the warlord stumbled. His massive frame swayed. His golden eyes flickered. Daniel's voice was quiet. It was never yours. Shanvok's snarl faded into a bitter smile. And then, he fell. One last opponent. Velana was on her knees, staring in shock. Shanvok, the warlord who had stood unchallenged for decades, was defeated. She should have felt victory. Instead, she felt fear. Daniel turned to her, the blade still glowing. Villana clenched her fists. You think this makes you a king? A god? Daniel shook his head. No. Just human. Her lips curled in frustration. That's what makes you dangerous. And then, she disappeared. Not teleported. Not fled. She simply faded, her body unraveling into mist. But her whisper remained. We will meet again, Blade Bearer. And just like that, she was gone. The new legend. The battlefield was silent. Daniel stood among the ruins, the Blade of Aegris in his grasp. The air around him still hummed with power. He had come to this world as a scavenger. Now, he was something else. Something new. He wasn't just the first human to wield the Blade of Aegris. He was the first to win. The war was over. But his story had only just begun.